Today, we're breaking down the main weapons used in medieval Europe, what each one was for, who carried it, and what it did well on a real battlefield. We'll cover the basics most soldiers relied on, the weapons built to deal with armor, and the tools used in big fights and sieges. I'll keep it simple, practical, and focused on how these weapons actually worked. Number 1. Spears and lances. The weapon that shows up in pretty much every part of medieval Europe, across nearly every century, isn't the sword, it's the spear. If you were a farmer called up for a local levy, a town guard, a mercenary, or even a well-equipped soldier in a lord's household, a spear made sense. It was straightforward, it gave you reach, and it was cheap compared to fancy sidearms. A spear is basically a long stick that keeps danger farther away, and that alone changes how fights look. When people imagine medieval battles, they picture single duels. Most real fighting was messy group work, and reach is everything in group work. Spears let a line of soldiers present a wall of points that's hard to rush without getting punished. They also help you keep formation, because you don't have to break ranks and get too close to do your job. The moment a group starts scattering, it stops being an army and turns into a crowd with weapons, and that usually ends badly. Now, there's a difference between a spear and a lance, and medieval people absolutely cared about the difference. A spear is a general-purpose pole weapon you can carry on foot, use in a line, and move with quickly. A lance is built around horseback use, usually thicker and longer, meant for that high-speed impact moment. The classic knight image, armored rider lowering a lance, comes from a real tactic, but it's not the only way cavalry fought. Lances could shatter, get dropped, or become awkward once the fight got close. That's why mounted fighters often carried backup weapons for the "now we're in the scrum" part. And even on foot, spears weren't one single design. Some had broad heads for cutting and slashing, some were narrower for punching through gaps, and some had wings or lugs near the head that helped control how deep the point could go, which mattered when you wanted to pull the weapon back and keep moving. As medieval warfare evolved into tighter and tighter infantry systems, especially in late medieval Europe, longer spears turned into pikes, basically spears that decided to commit. Pike formations weren't about individual skill looking cool. They were about teamwork, drilling, and holding space. When you hear about dense blocks of infantry that could stare down cavalry, that's the logic. Lots of long points, a rhythm of movement, and enough discipline that the formation stays a formation under pressure. And it wasn't just the front line either. Even behind the first row, men could lower their weapons into the gaps and add pressure, so the enemy felt like they were pushing into a living fence. In that sense, the spear is the default language of medieval battle. Simple, adaptable, and terrifying when a group uses it together. Not because it's flashy, but because it's practical. Number 2. Swords as sidearms. Swords get all the attention because they're iconic, they look good in art, and they scream status. But for a lot of the Middle Ages, the sword is what you carry, because you can afford it, not what you bring, because it's automatically the best tool for the job. Think of it like a reliable everyday carry item for someone who expects trouble. On a battlefield, a sword is often what you reach for when the main weapon is gone, broken, stuck, or just too awkward for the moment you're in. Early medieval swords, like the classic Viking Age styles, were built for cutting, and they were deadly in a world where many people didn't have full-body armor. As armor coverage improved, sword designs and fencing habits changed too. By the high and late Middle Ages, you see a range. The arming sword, one-handed, often paired with a shield. The long sword, two-handed, or hand and a half, and specialized chopping blades like falchions that hit hard without needing the finesse of a thin point. Here's the part that surprises people. When fighters faced heavy armor, sword fighting didn't always mean swinging like in movies. A lot of historical techniques focus on control. With longswords in particular, there are methods where the blade is used more like a lever and a steering tool, and the point becomes the main threat, because against strong armor, you're looking for openings rather than trying to brute force through steel. And yes, sometimes that includes gripping the blade in a controlled way, to guide the point with precision. It sounds wild until you remember a sharpened blade doesn't have to be razor sharp along the whole length, and armored gloves change what's safe to do. Another big myth is that swords were ridiculously heavy. Many battlefield swords are lighter than people expect, because a weapon that exhausts you after a minute is a bad weapon. The weight is often balanced to move fast, not to feel like a gym bar. The real heavy part of combat was the stress, the heat, and the fact you're moving in armor, on uneven ground, with people pressing into you. Swords also come with social baggage. A knight's sword wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, law, authority, class. That's why swords show up in ceremonies, why they're named in stories, and why so many medieval art pieces put them front and center. But in the mud and noise of a real battle, the sword's job is simple. Be there when everything else gets complicated. It's the weapon you can draw in tight spaces, use one-handed if you need the other hand for a shield or reins, and trust when the fight turns into pushing, grabbing, and quick decisions. So if spears are the grammar of medieval warfare, swords are the punctuation. Important, personal, and sometimes dramatic, but not the whole sentence. Number 3. Axes, maces, and hammers. If swords are the celebrity weapon, axes and blunt weapons are the working-class professionals that quietly solve problems. The axe is one of the oldest tools on the planet, and that's exactly why it shows up in medieval war. People already knew how to handle an axe from daily life, and making one didn't require the same level of specialized skill and high-quality steel as making a top-tier sword. Battlefield axes came in many shapes. Some were light and fast, others were heavier with a broad cutting edge, and some had that bearded shape where the lower part of the blade extends downward, which can help with hooking and controlling. But the big advantage is simple. Axes deliver force in a concentrated way. That matters when shields are common and when helmets and thick padding protect the head. A hard strike that rattles someone through their defenses can change the next second of the fight, even if it doesn't slice clean through armor. Then you've got maces and war hammers, and these are basically medieval answers to the question, what happens when everyone starts wearing more metal? A mace is straightforward, a handle with a heavy head, sometimes flanged like ridges or blades that focus impact. It's not about cutting, it's about transferring shock. Armor can stop a blade from biting, but it can't magically cancel physics. A strong hit can stagger, bruise, or break bones under armor, and it can make someone lose their footing, which is often enough for the enemy line to collapse around them. Warhammers are more specific. People imagine a carpenter's hammer, but many warhammers have a small hammer face and a narrow spike or pick on the other side. The idea is that the spike focuses force into a tiny point, which can threaten armor in ways a broad blade can't. In practice, these weapons also work as control tools. The hook or spike can catch on gear, pull at shields, or help drag someone off balance. You'll sometimes hear that blunt weapons were only used against armor, but that's too neat. They're also used because they're robust, because they keep working when edges get damaged, and because in the chaos of close combat, you want something that hits hard without needing perfect alignment. Another underrated detail is how these weapons fit into the social mix of medieval armies. Knights and men-at-arms might carry a mace because it's effective and it signals authority. Maces become symbols in some places. Infantry might carry axes because they're practical and multi-purpose. A weapon doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in a world of training time, money, and what you can actually get your hands on. And once you picture a crowded melee, bodies close, shields bumping, visibility low, it starts to make sense why simple, durable, hits like a truck is a very medieval design philosophy. Number 4. Polearms that ruled infantry. If there's one family of weapons that basically screams late medieval battlefield, it's polearms. These are the long weapons with a fancy head, part blade, part spear, part hook, built to do multiple jobs. When medieval armies got more professional and infantry started mattering more and more, polearms became the tools that let foot soldiers deal with almost anything. Cavalry, armored fighters, shield walls, you name it. The names can get confusing because different regions called similar weapons different things, and weapon makers loved customizing. But you can group them by the idea. You're putting a weapon head on a long shaft to get reach plus leverage. The halberd is the classic example, with an axe-like blade for chopping, a spike for thrusting, and often a hook or beak for pulling. The bill, common in parts of England, often looks like a big chopping blade with extra points and hooks, and it probably evolved from agricultural tools, because medieval war is constantly borrowing from whatever people already use. The glaive is more like a big knife on a stick, a long cutting blade for sweeping strikes. And then there's the poleaxe or poleaxe, which shows up a lot in armored fighting among elites. It's shorter than a battlefield pike, built for close to mid-range, and it's a total toolbox weapon. Hammer faces, spikes, axe edges, all designed to exploit armor weaknesses and win grappling heavy fights. What makes polearms so dominant is that they let infantry control the terms of engagement. A sword wants you close. A polearm says, "No, you're dealing with me at my distance." Against cavalry, that reach is critical. Horses don't want to run into a forest of sharp points, and riders don't want to get yanked or struck while moving fast. Against armored fighters, the hook and spike features add options. You're not just trying to cut, you're trying to off-balance, pull, and create openings for the group. And that "for the group" part is huge. Medieval fighting is often teamwork even when it looks like individual duels. If one soldier with a polearm pulls someone out of line or knocks them down, other soldiers can swarm and secure the moment. Another reason polearms matter is cost versus effect. Training an elite swordsman takes time. Training a disciplined group to use long weapons in formation takes time too, but the payoff on a battlefield can be massive. That's part of why late medieval Europe sees infantry forces, Swiss, Flemish, and others, develop reputations that can shake the old "knights always win" storyline. Knights are still dangerous, still important, still expensive tanks on the field, but polearms help show that battlefield power is shifting toward organized foot soldiers with reach, leverage, and a plan. It's one of those moments where military technology and social change are tied together. Who fights, how they fight, and what weapons they trust all start moving in the same direction. Number 5. Daggers and close-up work. Medieval combat isn't always at spear range or swinging distance. A lot of fights end up close, like uncomfortably close, because lines crash together, people trip, weapons snag, and suddenly you're in a wrestling match while wearing metal. That's where daggers become way more than backup knives. Daggers were everywhere because they're useful in daily life, easy to carry, and in a fight, they're the last resort tool that's still reliable when space is tight. You'll see types like the rondel dagger, with a stiff blade and round guard and pommel, designed to be controlled and to thrust into small gaps. You'll see basellards and other regional styles that blur the line between dagger and short sword. And then there's the misericord, often mentioned in connection with finishing blows on battlefields, which is a grim reminder that medieval war wasn't clean. But even staying on the practical side, the dagger's main advantage is that it's compact and strong. If your main weapon breaks, or you're grappling with someone, you can draw a dagger without needing room. Daggers also connect to the reality of armor. Full plate armor, especially in the late Middle Ages, can be incredibly protective, and that pushes combat toward control, wrestling, and targeting openings rather than just hit harder. That doesn't mean fighters needed magic tricks. It means they needed patience, leverage, and help from teammates. A dagger, used carefully, could threaten the places armor can't fully cover. Joints, gaps, visor openings, and the soft areas that have to move. That's also why you see so much emphasis in historical manuals on grappling, throws, and controlling the opponent's weapon arm. A knight wasn't just a guy who swung a sword. He was someone trained to fight in a system where armor changes everything about distance and timing. Shields fit into this close-range world too, even though they aren't weapons in the usual sense. Early medieval shields, like round shields, are mobile, active tools that can punch, bind, and create openings. Later, you get kite shields and heater shields that match cavalry and knightly combat styles. Smaller shields like bucklers pair with swords and help in quick, close exchanges. And on the other end of the scale, you get large shields like pavises used with missile troops, basically portable cover in a world where bolts and arrows can ruin your day. The point is, medieval weapon sets were built like layered plans. Long weapon first, sidearm next, dagger last. If the battle goes from organized lines to chaotic pushing, you're still not helpless. You're just switching tools as the situation shrinks around you. And that shrinking feeling, the moment when your fancy reach weapon is suddenly too long and your world becomes elbows, shoulders, and metal gloves, explains why daggers stayed popular for centuries. They're the weapon you don't notice until you really, really need it. Number 6. Bows and the reality of arrows. People love to argue longbow versus crossbow like it's a sports rivalry, but the bigger story is that arrows changed how medieval soldiers moved, armored up, and planned battles. A bow is scary because it projects force at a distance, and it doesn't care about how brave you look. A lot of medieval warfare is basically trying to manage that fact. Don't get caught in the open, don't let your formation get softened up, and don't pretend you can just tank ranged fire unless you're truly protected. The English longbow gets famous for good reasons. It's powerful, it can shoot quickly in trained hands, and in certain battles it's a huge factor. But it's not a magic wand. It takes serious training and strength to use effectively, and that training is a social project. Laws, practice culture, and time. That's why longbow systems tend to show up where communities invest in them. Most medieval people don't just pick up a warbow and instantly become battlefield archers. Shorter bows and simpler bows were more common for hunting and general use, while warbows pushed the human body harder. And then there's armor. Arrows can absolutely be lethal, but armor changes the odds dramatically. A well-armored man isn't invincible, but he's not the easy target people imagine. That's why archery tactics often focus on massed fire, angles, and forcing mistakes rather than expecting every arrow to punch straight through plate like paper. Arrows could hit less protected troops, horses, faces, hands, legs, and all the real-life places where protection isn't perfect. They could also wreck morale. Even if you're not hit, listening to a storm of arrows is stressful in a way that's hard to recreate. You're bracing, you're flinching, you're trying to keep formation, and you're wondering when you'll have to move forward through it. It's also worth remembering that arrows aren't just arrows. There are different heads for different jobs. Broadheads for cutting, bodkin-like points aimed at armor and mail, plus different shaft qualities, fletching styles, and draw weights. Medieval archers and armies cared about supply and standardization more than we usually imagine, because you can't run a major campaign on vibes. You need carts of arrows, skilled bowyers and fletchers, and a steady flow of replacements. Weather matters too. Rain affects strings, wind affects shots, mud affects movement, and suddenly, the simple bow is part of a larger machine of logistics and planning. And archers didn't always stand there like movie extras. They carried sidearms, used stakes or terrain when available, and depended on protection from infantry or fieldworks. Ranged weapons are strongest when the rest of the army helps them do their job, because an archer who gets rushed in the open is an archer having a very bad day. So the bow isn't just a weapon. It's a whole approach. Soften, disrupt, force the enemy to move the way you want them to move, and punish them while they do it. Number 7. Crossbows and early guns. Crossbows feel almost modern compared to bows, because they're mechanical and they look like devices. The basic idea is easy. You store energy by drawing the string with a mechanism, lock it in place, aim, and release. The big advantage is that you don't need the same lifetime of training to be effective. You still need skill, aiming, judging distance, maintaining the weapon. But you're not depending on the user's full body strength in the same way a heavy warbow does. That's why crossbows show up widely in medieval Europe, especially with town militias and professional infantry. They can be powerful, accurate, and psychologically intimidating. You'll hear the dramatic story about crossbows being condemned by the church at one point. And while the details can get complicated, the vibe is real. People saw crossbows as scary because they let ordinary soldiers threaten armored elites. Whether that changed the world overnight is debatable, but it definitely mattered socially. Crossbows come in different tiers too. Some are relatively simple. Others are heavy arbalists that require a belt hook, a lever, a windlass, or a chronicles, a geared device, to draw. The heavier the draw, the more time it can take to reload, which is why crossbows often work best with cover, like pavis shields, or in defensive positions where you can afford a slower rhythm. A crossbow bolt is usually shorter and stiffer than an arrow, and it hits hard at closer ranges. But again, armor complicates everything. People love clean, "this pierces armor" claims. Reality is messy. Angle, distance, quality of armor, quality of bolt, luck. Medieval soldiers weren't doing lab tests. They were trying to survive. This is also the doorway into early firearms, because late medieval warfare starts experimenting with gunpowder weapons on the battlefield. Early hand cannons and handguns are not the sleek muskets people picture. They're often awkward, smoky, loud, and not always reliable. But they have a few game-changing traits. They're terrifying to face, they can punch hard, and they don't require the same kind of elite physical conditioning as a warbow. Early guns start as specialist tools, useful in sieges, useful in certain formations, and then gradually become more practical as technology improves. Matchlocks and better barrels and better powder quality push firearms forward over time. During the late Middle Ages, you can end up with mixed forces where bows, crossbows, and guns all exist on the same battlefield, because armies don't replace an entire system overnight. They add a new tool, test it, scale it up, and keep using the old tools because they're still effective, and the supply chain already exists. And that mixed period has its own vibe. Commanders balancing rate of fire, reliability, training time, and cost, while soldiers deal with the noise and smoke of weapons that feel like the future arriving early. If you want a simple way to picture it, think of crossbows and early guns as force multipliers for regular people. They don't erase knights or swords. They just make the battlefield less predictable for anyone who assumes armor and status automatically means safety. Number 8. Siege weapons and battlefield machines. When medieval warfare gets serious, it's often about places, not just people. Towns, castles, bridges, gates, and supply routes. You can win a field battle and still lose a war if you can't take or hold the right strong points. That's why siege weapons matter so much, and also why they're misunderstood. A lot of the time, sieges weren't non-stop action. They were long stretches of waiting, building, negotiating, raiding for supplies, and trying to break the other side's will. But when the machines went to work, they were the loudest argument on the battlefield. The trebuchet is the famous one, and for good reason. It uses a counterweight to throw heavy projectiles, and it can be incredibly effective at smashing walls, damaging towers, and generally making defenders nervous. Earlier catapults like mangonels and other torsion-based machines use twisted ropes or sinew to store energy, and they can fling stones too, though the engineering details vary widely across time and region. Ballista-style machines, basically giant crossbows, appear as well, and while popular culture sometimes exaggerates their sniper role, they still show up in the medieval imagination as serious hardware. But siege warfare isn't only about tossing rocks. It's also about sapping, mining, building ramps, constructing siege towers, and using rams, tools that turn engineering into combat. A battering ram isn't just a log. It's usually protected by a structure, so the team using it isn't instantly wiped out by missiles. Siege towers aren't just ladders on wheels. They're mobile platforms that try to get attackers onto the walls at the right height with some cover. And then there are the smaller machines that don't get poster art. Mantlets, pavises, portable shields, fascines, bundles used to fill ditches, and field fortifications. Medieval armies could get surprisingly creative when they had time and materials. Even in open battles, you sometimes see quick defensive setups, ditches, stakes, wagon lines, because controlling space beats charging into chaos. There's also the economic side that people forget. A siege engine is expensive, not just to build, but to move. You need carpenters, rope makers, blacksmiths, laborers, guards, and food for everyone. Rope is a huge deal. It wears, it stretches, it hates moisture, and it can decide whether your engine works today or embarrasses you in front of both armies. Wood selection matters. Spare parts matter. Ammunition matters. If you're throwing stones, you need stones of the right size. If you're launching specialized projectiles, you need a supply chain that can keep up.